My name is Mike Hill, and I will about curricular planning below topic level, building a narrative of Weimar, Germany. So thanks very much for watching this. What I hope to do in the first video is to really look at the first half of the title and explain what I mean by curricular planning below topic level, and to give you an idea of theory that underpins the hopefully more practical examples that we will look at in this video, where we will take a hopefully interesting journey into Weimar Germany itself. Just introduce myself a little bit. I'm a history teacher at a comprehensive academy in northwest London, where we teach everything from year 7 up to 13. I'm not a head department. I don't have any additional responsibility. I'm just a very ordinary classroom teacher, and that's partly where the idea for this talk came from. So a lot of what I will say is about how classroom teachers can go to the process of curriculum planning and what that might like in practice. Because when I first started to become in curriculum, I've actually seen as kind of climb bounding topics. So you choose topics, you sequence what students study when, and you have rationale for that, and that's it. And once you've completed that process, that's the curriculum, and the rest is pedagogy. And I think, though, that macro planning is, of course, hugely important, and it's the kind of heart and soul of curriculum planning. I've also come to think that actually a lot more goes into planning a curriculum than merely choosing and sequencing topics. Secondly, when I still thought of curriculum planning mostly on this kind of macro level, two problems also to me. The first is that access to this kind of macro planning is unevenly distributed, we could say. For example, if you're a teacher new to a school, new department where the curriculum is already very well developed, you might think that there's not much else for you to contribute to that process and to the curriculum itself. Similarly, if you're teaching exam classes, you will be bound by exam specifications. And similarly, you might think, I haven't got much control over what I actually teach, so the curriculum is kind of closed off before you start it. Similarly, I've come to think, or it's become more obvious to me really, that a list of one well sequenced is curriculum. So something has to happen to that list for it to become a kind of fully formed curriculum. And because of these kind of ideas, I started to think of the curriculum less as a kind of mountain to climb, but rather an iceberg, where once we've chosen and sequenced our topics, a lot is still yet to happen below the kind of surface. And as I kind of said before, people sometimes draw a very clear line between the what of teaching, by which they mean the curriculum, and the how of teaching is just pedagogy. And I think actually is not often clear cut. Often, in order to bring the content to students and to bring students to the content, we need to make kind of smaller curricular choices, make that happen, kind of that more about sequencing content students and below topic level. And a metaphor that I found really helpful in helping me think about the curriculum is or comes from blog the curriculum as content structured as narrative over time. Curriculum is content structured as narrative. Once we start thinking that way, we really kind of start to kind of get going. And I found it really helpful because it helped me or gave me not just an idea of what the curriculum could look like, but also what it could feel like to my students and to me as a teacher. However, even though I know what a narrative is, and I could kind of point one out if I saw one, I find it more difficult to think about what does that actually mean to translate content into a narrative? What does that entail? What things we could start with, and what is important to consider when we do this? So I kind of went away, had to look at some kind of things about narrative, what narrative is, and what makes a narrative, and just two things I want to talk about in these videos really are the dimension of plot and place. So when we think about what makes a narrative, we start thinking, how can we turn this plot. The key reference for what is plot or what makes plot is Ian Forster's kind of series of essay lectures called Aspects of the Novel. Now, Forster, of course, is a very well-regarded novelist, drew a distinction between story and plot. And by story, it means kind of events arranged in subsequent order. So it's just in the order in which it happened. And the example that he uses is the king died and then the queen died. So the first event is the king died, and the second event is the queen died. But these events, they are only arranged in the order it happened. So far, nothing has happened to these events to kind of connect into a plot. So plot, on the other hand, according to Forster, is events arranged in consequent order. And the example he gives is the king died, and then the queen died of grief. So you can see how we've suddenly drawn a connection between the first event, the king dying, and the second event of the queen dying. We now know, established, that there's a kind of link between these two things. And that really, according to Forster, is the difference between story and plot. Now, you might think that's all well good and sort of interesting, but how to apply it to history? Now, someone who's applied very similar categories or terms to history is the historian Hayden White. And in his article, The Historical Text as Literary Artifacts, we say that what historians do really is that they take facts, or what he calls chronicle, and they don't confer them just as chrono, but they turn them into components of plot structures. And the process through which that happens is called emplotment. And only through that process of emplotment, White says, is that history gains explanatory power. If you just look at chronicle events, so event, that doesn't explain anything to you. In order for history to have explanatory power, historians need to emplot the chronicles and turn them into elements of a plot. Now, an example to explain this, I will give you more practical examples in these talk, but just give you an idea of what it might mean, really, is the original Star Wars trilogy. Now, don't please get worried if you don't know what Star Wars is. You probably know what it is, but if you haven't seen it, you don't have to. I'll explain it very briefly. The gist is that the original Star Wars trilogy were the films that were made in the kind of late 70s, early 1980s. How 20 odd years later, the producers of Star Wars wanted to make some more money, so they decided to make 3 more films, which were the prequel trilogy. Now, as you can see from that name, even though they were made later, the prequels happen or are set before the original trilogy. So the newer film happened in the story before the original films. And the first 3 films of the prequel trilogy tell the story about this young boy called Anakin Skywalker, who across or over these 3 films becomes kind of fascist supervillain called Darth Vader. That's it. That's the prequel trilogy in a nutshell. In the original trilogy, we follow the story of Anakin's or Darth Vader's son, who doesn't know who his father is. He joins this kind of rebel group, and then the 5th film has this epic showdown with Darth Vader. He kind of often or commonly history that Darth Vader is his father. That's the big twist in the kind of story. And in the 6th film, they fight again, and I won't spoil that for you. You can watch the film and find out for yourself. Now, what some Star Wars fans is that, and you might have already seen this when I was telling this story in that order to you, watching the films in that order really kind of ruins the big twist or big reveal in the film, because we already know who Darth Vader is. So when that reveal comes, that kind of loses all of its kind of power, all of its meaning. So what Star Wars fans have said is that it's actually better when someone watches these films for the first time, if you watch them for your own enjoyment again, is that you start with the first original film, so it's the story, and then you watch the film have this big reveal about Darth Vader. And think, how did this come about? Now I really want to know how that came to be this massive supervillain called Darth Vader. And it's at that point, then you sort of flashback and you watch the prequel of, you learn about Darth Vader, you learn about Anakin, how he becomes this person, and after you've watched these, back to the original trilogy, and you're kind of ready for a big resolution to that story. And what that really is, I think, turning these films or switching them around and tell a better story, is Emplotment. Because what Star Wars fans have done is they've taken the story, the raw material, as it were, of this kind of chronological overview, and switched it around to tell a more compelling story, to tell that same story in a better way. So it turns into a plot. Now, I don't suggest for a minute that as teachers we should teach it in non-chronological order. I think that would often really confuse students. But what it shows us, I think, is that something that is given, such as films that are already made, such as the past has already happened, such an exam specification that's all set for you, we can kind of play around with this and try to find ways of telling that story in more meaningful, more exciting, more interesting and memorable ways. So that's the first half of this video, really. This is what Emplotment might look like, and we'll look at practical examples later on. So for now, let's return to the second dimension that I hinted at earlier, which is place. And narrativists can really start to stress the importance of place, and have said that the setting with which a narrative happens is much more than just a neutral backdrop. The place of a story, of a narrative, actually gives meaning to that story. It adds layers of meaning, but it also shows our experience of that story. So you take a novel, for example, Wuthering Heights, that were set not in nature in the set of funds, that would no longer be the same story. And similarly, if you wanted to set or take the plot of a twist and make that happen in the Highlands of Scotland, that story or that plot probably wouldn't even work anymore. So the place of the narrative is really important to the narrative itself. And in history teaching, of course, this is kind of given another layer of complexity, because the place in which narratives unfold are imagined place. You can't really know what parts don't have a kind of model. We can go out and see it. And Sam Weinberg, who's a professor of education at Stanford University, has kind of developed more ideas about this. So what is that it is impossible for readers to comprehend texts without forming situation models. What we mean by situation models and forming them, everything that is implicit in the text, that's not explicit to understand what's happening. So Weinberg goes on to say, for example, images that describe a battle are scarcely understandable if a reader cannot construct a representation of the forces stood, what the battlefield looked like, and how the commander might have felt as he felt. So really, the development of place is not important in terms of narrative, but it also enables historical thinking. Because I've started about how can we really develop students in the past, because it's the way that they would the past something we can't control. So we don't have control of what they think and how they make sense of it. What we can do is try to give them something to use to construct these imagined pasts. We can try to curate the imagined pasts of our students. And it's a process that I have kind of started to have my own sort of thinking called world building. And that's what the teacher does. World building is all about the input given to students and about kind of developing these imagined landscapes in the curriculum so they have something kind of to use to imagine the past. This idea of world building really comes from fantasy literature and from authors, Tolkien, who invent imaginary worlds and then communicate them to audience. And we can learn a lot from this. And I've written about this in a bit more detail on my blog. I've plug that quite shamelessly, which is called In the Olden Days want to bit more about this, please do. It's also my pinned tweet at the moment, so you can look there and read it. And what I've learned from kind of the thing that already exists about building is that there's kind of two foundational ways of building works, and they're called building inside out and building outside in. And inside out approach, you really start kind of small scale area, and you then develop that gradually upwards until the kind of large areas that you've arrived represents or reflect or tie back to what you set up in that small area. And building outside in is kind of the opposite. You start off with a kind of overview of a large area, a kingdom, contents, outline what that looks like, what happens there, and you gradually build inwards until you arrive all base, and ties back to the principles you've outlined before. And once I kind of started to understand this basic dichotomy, I was just anywhere, any kind of, and my two favorite examples at the moment are opening paragraphs of In Mortimer's Time and Mark Morris's book King John. If you want to just pause the video at this point and just have a quick read of these two engines. So I'll just pause for a second. You can pause yours. You will see that start off in a kind of really small kind of area. It throws us straight into the alleys of medieval Exeter and gains to us what it looks like. But when you read the rest of the book, he doesn't stay in that place. He gradually builds outwards. He takes to medieval London, and from there he takes us out into the countryside and the towns and the villages and the farms. So he kind of gradually builds that world inside out. And Mark Morris does kind of the exact opposite. He starts off with this kind of big spatial sweep of an empire. He tells us that, I love this phrase, John ruling over millions of people, speaking at least half a dozen different languages. But he doesn't stay at that perspective either. He later on moves us right to the sieged castles of Normandy, into the towns and shires and forests of England. So Morris does the building outside in. And it's building the landscapes gradually as we go through them, that they are able to develop these really, this kind of rich sense of place for us as their audience. This kind of difference between building inside and outside. And I think we can do the same within the curriculum to help our pupils understand the past and imagine the landscape. So, first video started out what curricular planning topic will look like, and what does it actually mean to content. And I've tried to kind of outline two basic approaches that are used for that. The first one of which is Emplotment, turning the raw material of story into a connected plot. And the second is World Building, which is all about developing the past as an imagined landscape. So that's the theory part of it, and in this video we'll look at hopefully some more examples. Thank you very much.